Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this week's episode, we'll explore the fascinating and much understudied Second Battle of the Marne. We'll explore its origins, importance, discuss its potential position as the decisive victory on the Western Front, and take a close look at one particular American unit, the 3rd Division, who emerged from the fight with a reputation as one of the finest fighting units in the Allied order of battle. Well, hello Dan, a pleasure to be joining you around about, in fact, the anniversary time of the battle we're going to be discussing, the Second Battle of the Marne, which rages through this time in July. We're recording on the week, in fact, that the battle would have been occurring way back in 1918. So an interesting comparison there. And I have to say, I'm not sure what the weather's like where you are, but the weather here is about the same as it was at the Battle of the Marne. It's very hot.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point. Yeah, very warm where I am as well. But it's a very good point because the Marne, the Second Battle of the Marne, I should say, is very interesting in a number of different ways. The climatic conditions being one of them, but also the fact, I think, Spence, and we'll see this as we go through today's episode, that it's fought in a pretty unusual situation for a battle on the Western Front. It's not over an area of ground that's been torn up for years. There's not really a trench in sight, certainly in the first part of the fight. And it's fought in what has previously been a fairly semi-open set of warfare. In fact, it's going to remain so really from this point almost until the very end of the Great War in this area. So, I mean, how, in your mind at least, do those factors contribute to how the Second Battle of the Marne plays out, and particularly the Rock of the Marne episode we're gonna really drill down into?
I'm really glad you brought this up to start with, Dan, because listeners, it's really important as we go through the story of Second Marne to take yourself out of the trenches, because the armies had by the time of the Second Battle of the Marne. And in some ways, the Second Battle of the Marne is quite unlike any other battle of this scale on the Western Front, where the armies aren't fighting in organized trench lines. They're gone. The Germans have exited them. The French aren't occupying them. Instead, they're fighting much as they would in the Second World War. So largely in the open, defending strong points, whether they might be villages or woods or high ground, fighting perhaps from rifle pits, fighting from machine gun nests. But otherwise, this is a period of the war, indeed a battle of the war, that observers and participants compare most closely to 1914, because armies are manoeuvring across essentially open ground. And another point to make is that this is unspoilt ground. This area hasn't seen serious fighting since 1914. It's been 4 years since the armies were actually in this area. This is a sleepy sort of backwater until the Second Battle of the Marne begins. And so you have lush fields, woods in full leaf. You have picturesque villages, in fact, that have not felt the hard hand of war. And compared, if you're a soldier who'd been fighting in the trenches, a French soldier, for example, perhaps you've gone through Verdun in 1916, you'd seen the Nivelle Offensive in 17, it must have looked like a completely different world, because this is a beautiful area of France, in fact. And it's going to be the site of a battle that, as we said in the opening section, is perhaps the decisive battle of the Western Front in the entire First World War.
Yeah, big statement. And I think we're going to need to back that up as we go through this episode. But I genuinely think it can be done. It's an interesting one. And I think this is hugely an understudied area, particularly through British eyes, albeit there is going to be British involvement here and a couple of really famous units of the British Order of Battle who are going to find themselves way over in this sector. But in order to set the scene, I think we need to go back and just make that link, particularly with Belleau Wood as well. And we need to really drop back to the 21st of March, 1918. Of course, the story we've covered numerous times here, the famous Spring Offensive kicks off. It's going to be in roughly 5 different phases. There may be a 6th phase planned. And the general idea, of course, is to split the British and the French, drive a wedge between them, knock one or both of those powers out of the war, and bring the Allies to a negotiated peace. We know the story pretty well by now. What we need to just link up here is that the 3rd of those 5 major attacks is going to be the one which is going to slam into Belleau Wood. That's going to be eventually, of course, is going to dissipate. In fact, it's almost contemporaneous to this action here. There's still fighting going on the outskirts of Belleau Wood at the same time that the Rock of the Marne takes place. But in order to actually understand the bigger picture, we need to really look, I think more so, Spence, towards Blucher York and eventually to Gneisenau, and just understand kind of what the Germans are trying to achieve. Because at this point, they've already driven a huge salient, sometimes referred to as the Marne salient, in between the towns of Soissons, which is German-held, and Reims or Reims, which is Allied-held still, and an important rail hub, as well as being I think, more figurative objective. But importantly, Spence, is still in French hands.
This is really true. And the situation that the Germans, who've been driving the action through 1918, they definitely held the initiative through 1918. The situation they face at the end of the Blucher York offensive, which we discussed, of course, in our episode on Belleau Wood, is they've created, as you say, Dan, this huge salient. And in some ways, this was not really the German intention when they launched Blucher York. Blucher York was really designed to draw the French away from the British. The Germans have had two massive attacks against the British, Michael on the Somme, Georgette in Flanders. Both those have petered out. Blucher York's designed to try and draw the French away, draw them to the south, to set up, in fact, the British for the knockout blow. Problem is, Blucher York in some ways succeeds beyond Ludendorff, the German commander's wildest dreams. He breaks through on the Aisne front, he goes all the way to the Marne. German soldiers haven't been at the Marne since September 1914, so it's a huge advance. And it opens up a raft of opportunities for Ludendorff. He would like to try and turn towards Paris, although that's going to be extremely difficult to fight towards there. But if he can't do that, he would, as you say, Dan, he'd like to turn towards Reims and encircle and knock out this important city and draw more and more French troops in that direction to set up the British for what he sees as the decisive battle, which is called Hagen, which is going to be another offensive through Flanders that hopefully is going to, for the Germans, break through to the Channel ports, finish the British off once and for all, and then the French can be destroyed at their leisure. But the problem is this salient that they've created, the Germans, with Blucher York, is, like all salients, it has problems because it can be attacked on multiple flanks, west, east, and indeed to the front. And the Germans try and expand the breach, widen the breach, in fact, with Operation Gneisenau, but that doesn't really succeed. It's an inconclusive offensive. The French resistance is extremely tough. Not a lot is happening there. But Ludendorff is in no way discouraged at the start of July. He's determined to try and launch this new offensive, which is going to, as we've said, encircle Reims, draw off the French, and then set him up for the final blow against the British. And it's interesting that even though the German army has taken a real battering through these offensives, suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, expended millions of rounds of ammunition, Ludendorff is still immensely confident that he can do something with this. And in some ways, you can understand his confidence. Although Gneisenau has failed as an operation, the previous battles, Michael, Georgette, and Blucher York, have all really inflicted heavy damage on the Allies. And Ludendorff reasons that Gneisenau went wrong because it wasn't properly prepared, and there's certainly some evidence for that. This new offensive is going to be the one, and it's going to really hammer the French, draw off all the French reserves, they're going to rush to this area, and then the final blow will be dealt in Flanders. It's an extremely ambitious plan, and we can look at it now and go, this is probably over-ambitious. But in those the later weeks of June and the early weeks of July, certainly there are plenty in the Allied camp who are really worried about this, and there are plenty in the German camp who have confidence it's going to work.
There's a couple of things I think we can bring in here, and particularly with relation to the Americans, and also the fairly recent appointment of a new generalissimo on the Western Front, which is a huge thing. So an overall commander-in-chief of all forces. That, of course, is going to be Marshal Ferdinand Foch. He is, in effect, been voted as the guy who's going to look after the grand strategic plan of warfare on the Western Front. The problem is he doesn't actually control much in the way of troops. Each of the National Army commanders, Pétain for the French, Haig for the British, Pershing for the Americans, have all got their own objectives. They have at least agreed to work to a generally similar plan at this point, but it's still a very tricky thing to achieve. And remember, if we go back to the story of the Doughboys here, the one thing that Pershing has come away to Europe with, and it's a literal piece of paper in his pocket, is a note saying, Fight your troops under your command. Don't fritter them away to the French or the British, despite repeated asks and coercion and various other kinds of things. Now, interestingly, in this battle to come, Pershing, uncharacteristically for him, is going to do exactly that. He's actually going to hand over a number of divisions who are going to be used to plug gaps and eventually force that salient in. I think maybe, Spencer, gives us a little idea of just how serious the situation is at that time. The fact that he's even willing to do that in the first place.
Really good point. That the arrival of the Americans, they've of course been arriving in 17, and now there's full-scale divisions. And a division is about the size of a British corps, so these are very big divisions. They're arriving at just the right time because both the British and the French have taken an absolute battering. I mentioned the Germans have been battered by these offensives, but so too have the British and the French. And that's coming, of course, on top of all the casualties that have been suffered through 1914, 15, 16, and 17. So the Allies are short of able-bodied men. Their reserves are stretched. And so into this, the arrival of these big, fresh, inexperienced and ill-trained as they might be, but big, fresh fighting formations and enthusiastic as well, is really, really important. And the scale of the crisis, as you say, Dan, is such that Pershing is, it must be said, reluctantly agrees. It goes right back to the US government to finalize this decision. He reluctantly agrees to have his divisions put under French command to stabilize the line in front of the incoming German offensive. And that's a big move. And in some ways, I think it probably benefits the Americans in the long term because it allows them to fight alongside much more experienced fighting formations. I think if the American army had gone in to this battle just as a single cohesive American expeditionary force, you'd have had a lot more trouble. Fighting alongside the French, although it does pose some difficulties, actually also allows you to draw upon their experience, particularly combining with their artillery and their air force, which is very much battle hardened. But it's a sign. It emphasizes the point I just made that this is a moment of real crisis for both sides. The Germans, I think Ludendorff thinks he's going to win, but there's definitely a recognition that the dice are starting to turn up ones and twos now. So something big needs to happen here. So they're gambling everything. And the Allies as well are really concerned about the battering they're taking on the Western Front, with German offensives seemingly breaking through wherever they strike, inflicting massive damage on the Allies. How can we stop them? Is it even possible to stop them? So that the stakes are incredibly high at the start of July.
Yeah, and that operation known as Freudenstürm, or the Peace Offensive, which is going to, of course, push eastward. Just to describe it for you listeners, if it's going to prove useful, imagine a triangle running now or jutting out into the Allied lines. Either the top left and top right of that triangle are going to be Soissons and Reims, and the point of that triangle really is going to be the area around Chateau Thierry. That's the area that the 3rd US Division are going to occupy. In effect, what the Germans are going to try to do is push from the center into that bottom right diagonal of the triangle. That's going to be down towards Reims, hopefully cut it off rather than attack through it and then later on capture it, and also towards the important Champagne town of Epernay. So all of that pressure is going to be driving sort of southeastwards and driving away, of course, from the British, hoping to draw off again further reserves if possible. An interesting point here, the French National Commander, Philippe Pétain, believes that it's the bottom left part of the triangle, down towards Paris, that is at risk. And in fact, there's a wild panic in the weeks leading up to this, and in fact, in the first few days of the offensive, that Paris might still be under threat. But fortunately for the French, and Foch, who has guessed correctly exactly where the Allies, where the Germans are going to be pushing, he's able to marshal some forces, put them in that area, and he's going to be able to not only hold the defensive, which he's managed to do, and the Allies have managed to do really since the 21st of March, albeit at very high cost and sometimes by the skin of their teeth. But this time, something different's going to happen. Not only are they going to hold that German offensive, they're going to strike back. And they're going to strike back on the other side of the triangle, so down in that bottom left part, because they've worked out that the Germans are going to be overloading towards the east. They're going to be attacking with some 42 divisions. They're going to smash eastwards, but at the same time, provided that assault can be held in an area that's not that easy to maneuver large concentrations of troops, they're also going to be vulnerable to their own attack. And that's going to come in, and it's eventually going to result in the final phase of the assaults on the Marne.
And this is an interesting point that you've just made, Dan, because what makes the Second Battle of the Marne quite interesting is this is a swirling battle, the like of which probably hasn't been seen on the Western Front since the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, where the Allies are going to resist and absorb a major German offensive, and then they're going to snap back into their own counteroffensive within 24 to 48 hours. And that is incredibly difficult to do for a military, or any military, but especially a military of the size that the Allies are now engaged with. And it speaks to the way that the war has changed, that we're not dealing with trench warfare with miles upon miles of trench and barbed wire that has to be approached like a fortress. Now warfare is assuming a more recognizably maneuver style. But that doesn't mean that the fighting is going to be small scale, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy in any way, shape, or form. But listeners, it's really important to grasp this idea that this is a battle that looks a lot like the Second World War. Right down to the fact that there's going to be a lot of tanks. The Germans are also bringing tanks to this. Captured British Mark IVs are being put into German service. The French and the Americans are bringing tanks. You've got an enormous air battle going on over Second Marne. The Germans have committed about half of all their fighter strength on the entire Western Front are now down at the Marne Front, facing, of course, French and American fighter squadrons. So it's a huge industrial battle that if you were to transport a soldier from September 1914 to July 1918, you could say, well, you're on the River Marne where you were in 1914, but look how different the battle looks. So this is a swirling, complex battle on a really, really vast scale. And that doesn't suit the Germans, because the Germans have mastered in many ways the decisive strike, or the very heavy strike against British and French fixed positions. And they've done very well using these methods. It's significant that of the big German spring offences, Michael, Georgette, Blucher, York, the ones that really gained ground, they've all been against fixed Allied lines that have been in place for years. Gneisenau has not succeeded, and that's been much more of a swirling battle. It's been inconclusive. And now this offensive is going to face the same problems. Launching these mass assaults onto very flexible positions that the Allies have occupied in woods and hills and so forth is a very, very different beast. And on top of that, the German army in July 1918 is not the German army in March 1918. We've mentioned so many times on this podcast that a clock starts for Germany when America declares war in April 1917. And we ended the episode on Belleau Wood with saying that the last seconds are now showing on the clock. And we're perhaps at the last second by the time of the Second Battle of the Marne, because the German army has got lots and lots of problems at this stage.
Yeah, it's a really important thing to mention, actually. And just before we delve into the German army here, just to make a point, this is also a battle on a huge scale as well. Just briefly to give you an idea of the breakdown of all the units involved on the Allied side, at least, there are going to be 44 French divisions fighting at the Second Marne, 8 American, including the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, all of whom we've covered so far, 4th Division, famous 26th Div, 32nd, and even 42nd Rainbow Division are all going to be fighting in and around this area. 4 British divisions, including the highly regarded 51st Highland and the 62nd West Riding Division. They're going to be fighting around Tardenois, that's in the defensive actions, and then even 2 Italian divisions. So it's going to be a truly international affair, including a number of French colonial divisions, Moroccans and Senegalese. So it's going to be a really, really big fight. But as you say, Spence, there are issues particularly in the German army, but also just international issues at the moment. We're talking mid-1918 now. And this I think, hits a little differently given what we've just experienced the last few years. But of course, the Spanish flu is raging across Europe, and it's taking tolls, particularly on men of fighting age, rather unusually. Spanish flu has hit the German army incredibly hard. And there are 139,000 cases in June 1918 alone. These kind of numbers are simply unsustainable for the German army. There are plenty of other problems as well, Spence. It's by no means easy sailing. We've spoken about it a number of times, but the quality of food and rations coming up in the line is really starting to pinch, even on the front lines, but at this point.
It really is. And this is just I'd wait to this. This is the first wave of the Spanish flu, so it functions much like a flu. And I'm sure we've all had the flu, listeners, and you know there's a big difference between the flu and a heavy cold. You are going to be incapable of physical work where you have the flu. and then you're probably going to take another week to really recover from it once your symptoms have abated. So it's a very debilitating disease. Now, on top of that, you add a German army that has been underfed for years. Effectively, since 1916, it's been underfed. So German soldiers tend to take longer to recover from the flu. We don't have the statistics, but there's some suggestion that the flu is more lethal to German soldiers because they are physically weaker. And it's taking out, as you've said, Dan, 139,000 flu cases in the German army on the Western Front in 1 month in 1918. That's the equivalent of a very bloody battle that you've just lost. These men are out of the line. Now, Spanish flu is also affecting the Allies, but generally it's felt that Allied soldiers at this stage recover quicker and are able to take their place back in the line faster because they're better fed, they're of better health. Now, of course, the second wave of Spanish flu that arrives in the autumn and winter 1918 is this truly lethal dose. But nevertheless, this is still a very dangerous disease. And on top of this, as you say, Dan, you've got the general attrition. The battlefield casualties the German army has suffered have been huge. And we mentioned in a previous episode that because the Germans lead with their stormtrooper units, these specialist assault formations, their stormtroopers take heavy casualties. And these men who've gone through specialist training, they've got specialist equipment, they can't be easily replaced. It takes months to train up a stormtrooper and get them into an effective unit. And the Germans just have effectively, by the time of the Second Battle of the Marne, they basically run out of stormtroopers. They still have stormtrooper units, but now more and more these are just full of just regular German soldiers who haven't had the specialist training, who lack the specialist equipment. On top of that, two features of the battle that are really important are also going against the Germans. One is their artillery is getting really worn out. The Germans are firing so many shells, they're getting barrel wear, which makes their guns inaccurate. Difficult to replace these guns. The Germans are more and more relying on captured Allied guns to actually supplement their bombardments. And that's fine, but these guns fire differently. There isn't an unlimited supply of ammunition. There's lots of problems using captured Allied weapons in this. And I mentioned about the German Air Force, that over half, in fact, of the German Air Force is committed to the Marne front alone. But one of the problems the German Air Force has is fuel is becoming difficult to acquire. That German industry, of course, very fuel hungry. The Air Force fuel hungry. The British blockade has been choking Germany for 4 years. Germany does have a supply of oil from Romania, which it occupies, but that's not enough to supply all of Germany's needs. So materially and in manpower terms, the German army is worn down. And I would say, Dan, compare and contrast that German divisions, they're nearly all at below their paper strength, whether it's battlefield casualties or flu casualties. You've got certain restrictions on flying hours for the Germans because of a lack of fuel. You've got certain restrictions on bombardment patterns because of barrel wear. Compare and contrast this tired German army with the American Expeditionary Force, which is, as we've said in previous episodes, it's inexperienced, it's naive perhaps, but two things. It's very healthy and well fed, and it's extremely enthusiastic and determined to fight.
Yeah, and that morale, I think, is one thing that hasn't been seen in the German army for a very long time. The enthusiasm to fight, even arguably amongst the British and the French at this time, it is pretty poor. You know, there's a lot of war weariness going on. One thing that the Americans don't have at this phase is war weariness. And so if you combine that, I think, with these very large American units as well, we said 8 American divisions are going to take part in and around the fighting on the Marne. You could arguably say that's more like 16 American divisions because of the size and strength comparison, possibly even more. German divisions, remember, they're almost exclusively under strength. So there is going to be a significant American contribution to this. It's still going to be outnumbered by the French, we should say. About 3 of every 4 combatants fighting at Second Marne is going to be French. So there is that remembrance that we need to make of that particular situation. But it is, when it comes to the counterattack and the pushback, understandably, the Americans are going to play an outsized role because they've got the physicality, they've got the morale, the wish to do so, and they've also got the stage for the first time. Because we have seen a small action, and it is a small action in and around Belleau Wood, not too far away and in the not too distant past. But this is going to be the first time that there's going to be a real serious American contribution to a major offensive, and also before that, of course, a defensive on the Western Front. So whilst the eyes of the Allies are looking at a counterpunch, almost immediate counterpunch to this last German push, of course, the job's not done yet because that last German push needs to be stopped before anything else could happen. There's an important point to make here, Spence, and that's just a touch on operational security here. The fact that actually there's some pretty loose tongues in the German army. There's a couple of silly mistakes made, and actually the German plans for this final offensive are already in Allied hands well before 0 hour on that day. And that's gonna play an important role when we kind of unravel the story. But in order to do that, let's just zoom in for a second, Spence, because I know it's a subject you find particularly interesting, on one American division who are going to be on the flank of that German assault. But they're positioned in a really key location, and they're going to be a great example, I think, of the kind of tenacity that the Americans are going to show. Interestingly as well, almost for their very first time in truly defensive action.
We've discussed, of course, Belleau Wood. We've hinted at other US actions that we haven't covered them in depth. And now that that point you've made, it's the first really big defensive action the Americans are going to fight, is important because this is going to be the first time, and we're zeroing in on a single American division here, the 3rd Division, but we can apply it to other American divisions at this battle. It's the first time they're going to have felt really the full weight of a German offensive. And as we discussed in our previous spring offensive episodes, that means a massive bombardment. It means an absolute deluge of gas shells, including what the British call double cross, where you have one shell which has a vomiting agent in it, which penetrates your gas mask and makes you vomit into your gas mask, and an asphyxiating agent is with it. So if you pull your vomit-filled gas mask off to get some air, you asphyxiate yourself. A really horrible weapon. And though, of course, the Americans have fought the Germans up to this stage, it's been comparatively small scale. Now it's going to be the full effect of a German spring offensive. And that's an interesting point because so much American training up to this point had been focused on taking the offensive, fighting in the American exceptionalism way, advancing through open country. And 3rd Division in particular has not had the in-France training program that some other divisions we've mentioned have. It's had part of that training program, but it hasn't completed it. It's had to be rushed into the line instead. So it's largely dependent on the training that it's had in the USA, which, as we discussed in an earlier episode, is not very good. It's pretty limited and has very little defensive training at all. But it's got a couple of advantages. And I think this actually shows in some ways the strength of aspects of the American army. And 2 advantages to pick out about 3rd Division is, the first one is it's commanded by a pretty talented officer, which is Major General Joseph T. Dickman. And like much of the US Army's officer corps, he started his career in the Apache Wars during the Wild West. But he'd served all over the place. He'd served in the Boxer Rebellion as well. I think he'd served in the Philippines from memory. And in the pre-First World War period, he was one of a very small number, it has to be said, of what you might call American Army intellectuals. He'd had a teaching role. He clearly thought very deeply about war. He definitely had a feel for war, which I think belies the fact that he'd not seen large-scale combat. So he was a very useful divisional commander to have. That's one advantage. The second advantage is this morale element that we've heard, that the American 3rd Division was by no means downhearted or dismayed to find itself in this defensive position. If anything, it was confident about what it was going to face. It believed it was well trained, it believed it was well equipped, and in fact, it was itching for battle. Perhaps naive to the scale of battle it was about to find. But when you have this combination of an experienced commander with a very highly motivated fighting formation, albeit inexperienced, you're in a strong position. What, of course, complicates it is, as we've discussed, Pershing's had to break up the American Expeditionary Force temporarily, put his divisions into the line alongside the French. It means that 3rd Division isn't fighting alongside all American forces. It's actually part of the French 6th Army. And the commander of French 6th Army has already had his experience with the Americans.
Yeah, that's right. We're talking, in fact, we mentioned him just this last week when we were looking at the assault on Belleau Wood, talking about General Dugout here, who is an interesting character. I think sometimes misunderstood, certainly controversial figure. He doesn't always follow the party line, and particularly by 1918, I think most notably here, Spence, one of the things that really has been adopted almost across the board by this stage is to use a defense in depth method, defense in depth system, which sees multiple lines and in effect allows for units to soak up pressure, bend but not break. Now, Dugout doesn't follow this line, and he prefers if you like, a slightly old-fashioned, rigid defensive policy, particularly anchored on natural barriers and natural obstacles. But there's no real depth in the defensive measures that he puts in place, and this is totally against actually what limited training third div have had about the defensive and defensive doctrine generally. They have been told and have looked at the German experience, which the Brits themselves have adopted, not very successfully, it should be said, in the first part of the spring offensive. But the idea is to just layer that defense. If possible, if there's a natural obstacle, absolutely use it. But use that as your first part of defense, and then good coordination with artillery and depth and just breaking up attacks piecemeal as they come in. Dugout doesn't go for this. Incidentally and interestingly, third div are going to go for this. And they're going to go for this very notably and successfully down on the Marne. So, and that's, of course, where we're going to find them. So on the 15th of June, 1918, as this German offensive is due to take place, bear in mind, the French and the Allies as a whole are aware of this. They know that midnight is going to be the start point. And actually 10 minutes before midnight, there's already going to be disruptive efforts to break up that German attack. And they're pretty remarkable in a sense, Spence, because it really does draw the teeth of much of the German assault before it even gets off the start line.
That's a really good point. And just to sort of add some weight to this, Dugout's got a great quote about how he wants Sixth Army to defend the River Marne. He says he wants his forces to defend it with 1 foot in the Marne, so right up on the riverbank. And that's not really practical because the riverbank is as we've said, this is an area that's basically unspoilt. It's not seen war for years. It's covered with trees and undergrowth. So defending right on the riverbank, very, very difficult. But this idea about fighting the Germans right on at the River Marne itself perhaps finds an expression in the fact that the Allies have, for once, have predicted and are prepared for a German offensive. One of the things that have made the German offensives in the spring much more successful was they often achieved local surprise and did so well. This time, as you say, German, we might say information security has been poor, prisoners have been taken, deserters have come in. Even some French prisoners have managed to escape from the Germans, and they've been listening to their captors boast about when this offensive is going to be. They've managed to escape and get into French lines and pass this information on. So the Allies have very good information about when the attack is going to begin. And this decision to lay down a counter-bombardment, what the British would have called a spoiler, straight into the German position, even before the German bombardment begins, is really crucial to the success of the defense along the River Marne, because it takes the Germans completely by surprise. It's very heavy. There's no ranging shots, just everything comes flying into the Germans. And bear in mind, listeners, the Germans are on the north bank of the Marne. They're preparing one of those incredibly difficult military operations, a crossing of a major waterway under enemy fire. And the way the Germans want to do it is through their own very complex and heavy bombardment, which is very strictly timetabled. There's going to be a creeping barrage. There's going to be a heavy gas attack and things. And suddenly the Allies say, well, we're not going to wait for you to punch us. We're punching you first. We love a sporting metaphor on this podcast. It's like somebody's landed a really good counter jab as the opponent is coming in. And the Germans react by, they're shocked. There's heavy casualties, especially in the assembly trenches. And what it means is the Germans rush their attack. They decide under this very heavy bombardment, we can't just sit here and take it or begin the attack ahead of schedule. And it means that the German attack, rather than being this massive hammer blow that's meant to hit more or less simultaneously along the Allied lines, instead, it's sort of a series of much smaller hammer strikes against the Allies, which means that artillery support for the Germans, in some cases, the Germans lose their own creeping barrage. It disappears. It advances too fast for them. In other cases, parts of units get across the Marne, but other parts of the unit can't. It means that the attack is disrupted from the moment it begins. But I think it's testament to just how tough this depleted and battered German army is, that despite this, German forces do get across the Marne and do actually begin their attack.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, because when we, and for anyone that ever goes to visit the Marne, it's really quite striking. There's a pretty sizable, it really is a valley. So the river lies with sloping banks down to it and sloping banks away from it. There's also a number of rail lines in the area, particularly behind the 3rd Div sector, that also offer protective opportunities. But in order to get across the river in the first place, of course, the Germans have got to quite literally work their way across this, say, 40 to 50 yards of open water. So it's not a huge river. It's certainly wider in many other places. This is, in fact, chosen in this general area to the east of and the northeast of Château-Thierry because it's slightly narrower at that point. But also bear in mind the Allies, the French, the Americans even, have destroyed pretty much all of the pre-existing bridges over it. So to get across the river is going to be very tricky to do. And in order to do that, the Germans, who remember are resource tight and have been for such a long time, they're going to use multiple different methods. There's going to be more than a dozen attempts to pontoon the river, even within the 3rd sector alone. There's going to be many more elsewhere. There's going to be barges. There's going to be various different ad hoc methods used to just try and get troops across the river at all. And bear in mind, they're doing this under a pretty ferocious counter barrage, and not a counter barrage where you've got pre-existing shelters, concrete emplacements, very deep trenches and dugouts to shelter from. Bear in mind, this is almost open warfare, and this is against 1918 artillery in open warfare. As you mentioned, Spence, some devastating losses suffered just during that. But at the same time, the Germans do get across, and in some cases they get across in large numbers. One place where they struggle, or one place where perhaps our focus will lie for the next few minutes, is of course in front of the men of the 3rd Division.
This is a really interesting point because I think it speaks to the nature of the battle. As you say, Dan, Germans do get across the river, not necessarily quite the way they'd like to, but when they're across the river and you do have this very heavy pounding German bombardment, you do have this dense gas attack as well going in, it's going to put the Allied defenders potentially under pressure. And one of the reasons for that is, as we keep saying, this is open warfare. It's not that the Germans are advancing on a trench system that's screened by barbed wire. They're advancing through woods and undergrowth, over hills, through small villages. And that offers opportunities for both attacker and defender. And for 3rd Division, I think the position that they're defending sort of captures a lot of this. Because as we've said, Dugout has ordered his forces defend the Marne right on the banks, effectively. And Dickmann has said, absolutely not. That's a violation of everything that he knows, everything he believes about defences. And so 3rd Division are actually arranged in, we can call it a defence in depth. I think that implies a level of organisation, a level of construction that doesn't really exist. But what the Americans have got is a 3-line system, an outpost line, which is pretty close to the river, actually. It takes advantage of the trees and the undergrowth near the river. You've got rifle pits and some machine guns there. It's designed to break up the German attack and then potentially fall back into the next line, which, confusingly, 3rd Division insists on calling the 2nd outpost line, but we would probably call the main line of resistance. And several hundred yards away from that tree line is another line, which, on the critical part of 3rd Division's front, by fortuitous coincidence, there's actually a railway line that runs parallel to the River Marne. And this railway embankment makes for a very, very good defensive position. The Americans have dug in on the reverse slope, and because it's slightly elevated, you can actually dig quite deep into it. So there are command posts dug into this railway line. You've got good vision down into a sort of valley area as the River Marne meanders its way through the valley. So you've got good observation here, not only for your guns, but also for artillery support that can come in. The disadvantage is it's relatively linear. So by following a railway embankment, inevitably you're going to get a broadly horizontal position. There aren't too many zigzags or cutbacks in this, which means if somebody gets onto your flank, you're in real danger. They can roll right down that railway line and turn you inside out. But that's the main line of resistance. And then there's a 3rd line, which is called by the Americans wood line, but we would call it reserve line, which is back in an area of woodland a few hundred yards back. And that is purely a reserve area. It could potentially become a line of resistance. You can defend a wood line, of course, but it's not really planned that way. And what's interesting is Dickmann actually gives his units leeway on how they want to deploy. He doesn't sort of force them to say, I want you to implement your system rigidly. And so different regiments actually approach it a little bit differently. The two particular 30th Regiment, which is on the left, and 38th Regiment, just to give you an example, listeners, the 30th Regiment really spreads its forces across all three of those positions, the outpost line, the rail line, and the wood line. But 38th Regiment, I should say, which is to the right, it prefers to put more emphasis towards the front. And there's reasons for this. One, they don't want the Germans getting across at all. Secondly, the actual sight lines that 38th Regiment has are quite good as long as you're in the front line, and they think they can engage the Germans as they're coming across the Marne. Whereas if you go back onto the rail line, you don't quite have the same sight lines. And the other thing is 38th Division is a little concerned because it's on the far right of the American line. It is the rightmost regiment. It's got French on its right, and there's also a series of valleys on its right, which offer an opportunity. If the Germans get into those valleys, they're in dead ground. The Americans can't really see them. They could get behind the Americans, they could get into the American flank, and they could roll up that railway line as well. And in fact, 38th Regiment, who got the wonderful commanding officer, Colonel Ulysses Grant McAlexander, actually constructs uniquely a second set of defences. Trenches, but really we're talking rifle pits and machine gun nests, not a continuous line of trenches. But they construct trenches that are facing 90 degrees away from their main line, just in case the Germans get on their right-hand flank. And so the defense in this position has to take account of all the different terrain features, which I think speaks to the nature of this open battle and this confusion that's going on. And although the Americans have occupied this position, the preparatory bombardment to disrupt the Germans is going in. I stand to be corrected by this, listeners. I don't have the statistics on hand, but I believe 3rd Division suffers the heaviest bombardment of any US division has suffered up until this point in the war. It's hit by an enormous amount of shrapnel and high explosive. Its rear areas, particularly the wood line, is deluged with poison gas, and much of it the double cross, which we discussed earlier. It's a real pounding, hammering assault. And one thing I think we can say is if it hadn't been for that Allied preparatory bombardment or a spoiling bombardment going in, the German assault would have been far more ferocious, because the bombardment that hits the Americans is absolutely pulverizing. There's an American account, in fact, I believe actually it's from 26th Division rather than 3rd Division, so a little bit elsewhere on the Marne, about some of the men who are under this bombardment actually go temporarily insane and have to be physically restrained because they're trying to just escape from their trenches, from their rifle pits. That's how ferocious and prolonged it is. And this is, of course, a common feature of the Western Front, but it's the first time that the Americans will have come under this kind of bombardment. And in some ways, it's worse even than the great bombardments of 1916 and 17. With those bombardments, the Allies, or the Germans for that matter, were in deep trenches, offers you a lot of protection. It's still psychologically horrendous, but you're protected. Here, you're fighting in the open, Dan, and this period of bombardment, which goes on for several hours, is what a baptism of fire.
Yeah, huge casualties sustained. And even those that aren't actually directly hit by this stuff certainly are really shocked by it. And I think it makes it even more remarkable in a sense that the American defense here is so stubborn, particularly when we look at more experienced units off to their flanks. And I should add here, it doesn't scream massive confidence in your allies when you deliberately dig a refusing flank trench at 90 degrees to where your French allies should be, on the potential or the possibility that they themselves might depart their own front lines in quite a hurry. But it's a good thing that it does happen, because actually, despite the fact that there's this pulverizing bombardment comes down towards the American 3rd Division position, particularly against the 30th, and as you say, the 38th Regiment's on the right. When the 10th and then 36th German divisions finally push forwards and start feeling their way across the Marne, they too are hit by a return fire. And that return fire is pretty withering as well. So not only have we got artillery smashing in and breaking up the pontoons and destroying those crossing points, but also you've got an entire machine gun battalion, plus the 2 machine gun companies of each of those regiments are pouring a continual fire down. And this is something that's regularly commented on for this action. Almost a perpetual sound of machine guns firing throughout this entire 24-hour period of battle, as Americans just plummet from the high ground directly down to the river line, machine gun round after machine gun round, and actually do some devastating work. That being said, and despite all of the backdrop that we've added here to the lack of morale of the German army, the exhaustion, the lack of food, they still managed to find ways across, get into those first American trenches, particularly around the 30th Regiment's area, and engage in a very brutal fight. What's more concerning, though, this is fairly on in the action, the French division off to the right, so that's that abutting the 38th Regiment, they are going to start departing. They're going to be hit by, again, an equally powerful assault from the 128th Regiment of the German 36th Division, who's going to penetrate into the forest and into the valley of Surmenland, which is a really problematic area. That one that you mentioned, Spence, why there is that flank protection dug. And we're going to start to see a French withdrawal on the right flank of the American positions. This is a really big problem. In fact, it's going to be one which is going to lead to a famous phrase which Dickmann, the commander of 3rd Division, is supposed to have uttered or perhaps even shouted towards withdrawing French troops. Quite simply, "Nous resterons là." We're staying there. And that ultimately is going to become the famous motto of the 3rd Division. But by God, they do stay there, Spence.
Don't they just? And you've made a great point about this withering hail of rifle fire and machine gun fire that the Germans attack into. And German accounts talk about just this endless stream of bullets that are coming at them. The German creeping barrage is meant to walk the Germans onto the American position, but because of this, the disruption the Germans have had, they lose the barrage in front of 38th Division. And so they're basically fighting through. The barrage is firing much more distantly. Germans are trying to fight through from position to position, being absolutely flayed by machine gun fire from the front. And the American position of the 38th, which of course is quite densely packed towards the River Marne, it's created all kinds of killing lanes, and it's incredibly difficult for the Germans to fight through it to the front. But the problem is, even though the Germans are having problems assaulting across the Marne, they have penetrated in certain regions. And crucially, as you say, Dan, they've got onto the right flank of 38th Regiment, and they start to move through those valleys, and they start to appear and start to put flanking fire into this. And this causes 38th Regiment to have to divert its resources. Those pre-constructed defenses are incredibly useful and do enough to hold off the right flank. But then on the left as well, 30th Regiment, American 30th Regiment, that starts to fall back into its reserve zone, which is that wood line we mentioned before. And that exposes 38th Regiment's left flank as well, because 38th Regiment has packed the forward line to try and stop the crossing. And it's largely succeeded in that. The Germans have got a very precarious toehold across the Marne. But now its flanks are getting turned in, and 38th Regiment ends up fighting in an almost a horseshoe-style formation, with both flanks refused, still holding the front line from the Germans who are trying to double forward. And it has the potential for being a real disaster. Germans bring in additional artillery fire to try and smash up this position as well. The Americans are under attack, under fire from all directions. There's localized counterattacks to reclaim key positions. There's fighting over things like machine gun nests. Germans want to knock out that machine gun nest. The Americans want to keep it going. Some cases, machine guns are said to have changed hands. The Germans overrun a machine gun nest. The Americans charge and take it. Above all else, incredible confusion and a bitterly close-range battle. But the key thing is, although the 38th Regiment is under this intense fire, and especially between about 11 a.m. and 12 p.m., it's really the crisis moment of the 38th Regiment. It doesn't break. It gets pounded from all sides, but it holds the line. And because the German attack across the wider front is largely petering out, eventually the 38th Regiment begins to become aware German fire is slackening, the artillery is leveling off, Germans seem less inclined to push forward. And that's because 38th Regiment's held, it blocked this German advance, crucially held up the right flank of 3rd Division, and across the wider 3rd Division front, the German attack is just completely spent. It's got nothing left. It's taken very heavy casualties. And one thing to sort of emphasize about this is, we talked in previous episode about the American Army's badly trained, its officers have the 90-day wonders, or the Sam Browns, not really experienced in any way, shape, or form. Well, I think one thing we have to say is that the battle that 3rd Division fights is a platoon commander's battle. Dickmann himself, he doesn't get much communication from the front line. He knows there's an intense battle going on. He can hear it, he can see it, or can see explosions from the front, but he can't get much information about what's happening. He has to trust in his subordinates, and they in turn trust in their platoon commanders. And so although these American officers and indeed men might not be that well trained, they're certainly not experienced, they definitely prove their mettle here, Dan, and hence the nickname, the Rock of the Marne, which is, initially it's applied purely to 38th Regiment, but then it is expanded to include the entirety of 3rd Division. And it draws a comparison to an American Civil War battle, the Battle of Chickamauga, where a Union general, George Thomas, had held the line as the Union position was collapsing in the face of a Confederate assault, and he became known as the Rock of Chickamauga. And the nickname the Rock of the Marne pays direct tribute, of course, to this. And it is still the nickname of 3rd US Infantry Division to this day.
Yeah, and let's be fair, it's a pretty cool nickname as well. And it absolutely fairly describes exactly what these guys do. And these are experienced French troops on the right flank who are falling back. And these are a highly motivated and well-regarded guys of the 30th Regiment who have to bend but don't break. But the 38th just stay still. And they soak up this pressure. Eventually, they blunt the attack of both the 10th and the 36th Divisions, who were fairly decent formations, actually. 6th Grenadiers, 47th 398th Regiment, all within the 10th German Division. And the 5th Grenadiers, one of the key fighting formations within the 36th. So these are solid formations that the Americans are holding off. And the fact that they managed to do it and the fact they managed to blunt this attack, I think, is absolute testament to the resilience of these men. And if you don't believe me or even you, Spencer, don't necessarily take our word for it. Let's see what Pershing had to say. He said the following: "A single regiment of the 3rd Division wrote one of the most brilliant pages in the annals of military history in preventing the crossing at certain points of its front, while on either flank the Germans, who had gained a footing, pressed forward. Our men were fighting in 3 directions, met the German attacks with counterattacks at crucial points, and succeeded in throwing 2 German divisions into complete confusion, capturing 600 prisoners." That's pretty good going.
It is, and especially when we consider what we've discussed in this set about the Doughboys up until this point, this is not in any way a battle-hardened division, and it's not even a well-trained division either. It's had to go through this, the American training, which is not really adequate. It's had a very truncated version of the training in France, and now it's in an intense battle. And I think it's testament to the determination, the enthusiasm, that word we keep using about American troops. But also, let's not just sort of write this division off as naive amateurs who happen to do well. What thing we can say, and I know both you and I, Dan, we've been to this battlefield, we've guided on this battlefield, is it's not an easy battlefield to command on. And this is looking at it in the 21st century. And then sight lines are quite limited, communications are difficult. It is a platoon commander's battle. It is down to lieutenants or captains to make these decisions. And ultimately, they make the right decisions. And they learn on the job. They learn very quickly. And it is a really impressive feat of arms. In a wider feat of arms, I should add, because, of course, the French and indeed the Italians are also involved in this battle. They're also fighting the Germans across this vast Marne front. And they effectively, although we've picked out 3rd Division as part of our Doughboys set, the entire battle, although the Germans do break through in certain points of the Allied line, the entire battle on this day is really, it's a tremendous Allied defensive victory.
I think the point there you've made, Allied, is really key when it comes to this story because, of course, it is, and I think it's quite fitting personally, that it's an Allied victory or defensive victory that ultimately stops the last of the great German spring offensives. Because from this point onwards, there is going to be no more defense. It's going to be attack and attack and attack. And eventually it's going to end on the 11th of November, 1918. It's interesting. I think maybe from a British historian's point of view, maybe we need to eat a little bit of humble pie here, Spence, because when the both of us discussed the story of the great spring offensives and how they were stopped, and then when the pushback starts, quite often Brits will refer to the 8th of August 1918, the famous Battle of Amiens, and the breaking of the German line at that point. Is there an argument, and perhaps even a strong one, to say that actually it's from the breaking of the German attacks of the 15th and then the subsequent Allied re-attack on the 18th, the counterattack? Is it fair to say at that point, really, that might be the start of the famous 100 days?
It is. And it's certainly from a British perspective, the 100 days always starts on the 8th of August, the Battle of Amiens, we've discussed elsewhere in the podcast. It fits neatly into the 100 days, and it draws comparisons to the 100 Days campaign that ended Napoleon in 1815. But the real beginning of the Allied victory begins at 2nd Marne, where the counterattack against this salient, this huge bulge that is stretching down to the River Marne, this Allied counterattack, French-led, but involving Allied troops. You've got 3 French armies, 10th, 6th, and 5th, going from west to east, who are going to attack the salient with the idea of basically cutting its neck off and encircling German forces within it. And Second Marne it's the beginning of the end for the German army. Now, I know it's often said Amiens is the beginning of the end. Ludendorff called Amiens the Black Day of the German army, which it was. But Second Marne is also is more so perhaps the beginning of the end. The bombardment that opens Second Marne for the Allies is like nothing the Germans have ever faced. It's an unregistered bombardment, so no ranging shots, all fired from the map. First time the French have used that method on a really large scale, and crucially, whereas the Allies knew the Germans were coming on the 15th, the Germans don't know the Allies are coming. They don't expect this massive assault that hits them. And it is a very modern-looking assault as well. It's a multinational series of French-led armies. They're using heavy tanks in the front line to breach the lines. There's a mass of lighter French tanks waiting to exploit the gaps. There's some French cavalry operating in this battle too. The skies are absolutely packed with aircraft, carrying out ground support missions as well. And into this is another mobile battle where the US and indeed French forces are going to achieve advances the like of which the Allies haven't seen since the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914. And to give one example, Dan, 2nd US Division, which is now actually being commanded by James Harbord, who had ordered the 4th Marine Brigade into Belleau Wood, it makes an advance of about 10 kilometres, and it probably actually advances even more than that because its jumping off point isn't quite the same as other units. It advances 10 kilometres and it suffers 2,150 casualties. Now, to perhaps our ears, that still sounds heavy casualties, but in the context of the First World War, if you could have offered any commander in the First World War, your division can advance 10 kilometres in exchange for just over 2,000 casualties, I think they'd have taken that rate of exchange.
Yeah, it maybe gives you an idea of just how bloody and horrific the fighting on the Western Front is, that sounds like a good deal. Today, it certainly doesn't. But at the time, as you say, you look at gains on the Somme or at Passchendaele or Arras or, of course, at Verdun. That's very, very cheap for the territory gained. And more importantly, it's not just sustaining limited casualties, actually causing casualties to the enemy at the same time. And we start to see, the famous analogy of the Great War and how the trench lines move on the Western Front. We've seen the German tide of 1918 reach its high point. It's now it's on the ebb, and it's just gonna go back and back and back. And that really, as far as I see it, is the Second Marne. That's where that point changes from the 18th of July onwards. We're going to just see assault after assault. And we should bear in mind, there are going to be 8, perhaps even 9 American divisions involved in this. They're all going to play their part, from the 1st and 2nd divisions. 3rd division, of course, we heard from, who are going to switch onto the offensive as well. The famous Rainbow Division with its Douglas MacArthur's and characters like that. 26th and 28th division, the Keystoners, they're all going to be pushing forward and really going to play a huge part. And I think this goes some way to understanding, if we look at it from Pershing's perspective, what the prize is for his, if you like, reluctant but albeit ultimately willingness to give up some of his units into French command, and he is going to be given a prize of sorts. It's going to be a slightly grim one, but for the first time, he's going to be given his own army. He's going to be given his own distinct set of battlefields, an area to assault, and ultimately we're going to see the American Expeditionary Force that is going to emerge in November as one of the dominant forces on the battlefield for the very first time.
We are, and of course the deal that Pershing strikes is he'll give out his divisions to be part of the Allied army in return for getting to bring the American Expeditionary Force back together and conduct its own operations, so fight its own battles, go for its own objectives, and fight as a cohesive national fighting force, which is, of course, what the Americans had always wanted from the moment that they'd entered the war. And in some ways, it's the right moment to do it, because the American divisions that fight at the Second Battle of the Marne, they have now experienced mass-scale Western Front warfare in the open, and they've suffered for it as well. By the time the Second Battle of the Marne winds down, the Allies have suffered about 95,000 casualties, of whom about 39,000 are American. So a high proportion, considering that this is primarily a French battle, are American casualties. And that's testament, in fact, to their inexperience and perhaps their naivety. Indeed, French commanders who see the Americans going into action draw comparisons to the American attacks look like French attacks of 1914. But as we've said repeatedly, they're now attacking 1918-style defenses, and that comes at a heavy human cost. And in fact, the casualties the Americans suffer at Second Marne creates a bit of a ripple effect back in the USA. It's a little bit of an alarm about, crikey, the war is going to be much bloodier than we expected. We're going to need a lot more men, and it leads to some changes back in the USA. But to go back to the point we've discussed, is this the true moment? Is this the decisive moment for the Western Front? I think there's a very strong case that it is, because the damage the Germans take down here is massive. From memory, I believe about 20 German divisions are written off from the German order of battle by the Battle of the Second Marne. And although it's not perhaps the victory that Foch would have liked, he really wanted to cut that salient off and bag everybody in it. He doesn't quite manage that, but he inflicts huge damage on the Germans. And crucially, for the first time since the German spring offensive has begun, the Germans have to abandon conquered territory. And that's a massive psychological blow. So you have the huge physical damage they've taken, combined with this psychological blow. And let's not forget, their assault across the Marne was nicknamed the Peace Offensive. That was the image Ludendorff was portraying. This is it. It's clearly gone completely wrong. And the blow to Germany, physically and morally, is absolutely massive. And the blow to Ludendorff is very heavy too. Let's go to Ludendorff's words that he wrote after the war. He remembered, at the beginning of July 1918, I was convinced, I confess it, that before the 1st of September, our adversaries would send us peace proposals. We expected grave events in Paris for the end of July. That was on the 15th. On the 18th, even the most optimistic among us knew that all was lost. The history of the world was played out in 3 days. In Britain, certainly Britain First World War studies were very fond to quote Ludendorff saying the Battle of Amiens was the black day of the German army. But let's not forget, he says the history of the world was played out in 3 days at the Second Battle of the Marne. And for the First World War, I think that's very true, Dan.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's very powerful. In fact, from memory, the German Army Group commander there, Crown Prince Wilhelm, also feels the same. In fact, goes back to his father, Kaiser Wilhelm, and explains to him, as far as he's concerned, following the 18th of July, the war's lost. That's it. It's done. It's not going to be achievable to gain a victory on the battlefield from this point onwards. And so I think, in conclusion to this, I think we can truthfully say a turning point. Absolutely, the turning point. Perhaps it's one of them, but it's certainly one of the key ones if that is the case. And from the Americans as well, for the Doughboys of the AEF, I wonder, Spence, could we argue that it's a turning point for them too?
I think it is. I think it's their first taste of mass battle. And it's given them a bruising experience. Nearly 40,000 or 39,500 American casualties is no small matter. And it's introduced them into the realities of the intense kind of fighting they're going to see over the next few months. Massive barrages, dense poison gas barrages, intense machine gun fire. It's a really bloody learning curve. And we talked in the Belleau Wood episode that the American Marines and part of 2nd Division go through a learning curve that the British and the French have had to endure over years. They go through it in about a month. And I think the divisions that are involved in Second Marne go through something similar. They really learn the realities of war very, very quickly. It's a turning point for the American Expeditionary Force. But is every lesson completely absorbed? Because Pershing now has his American Expeditionary Force at the end of Second Marne. He's going to launch it into his own offensives. He's going to fight a distinctly American campaign going into September. But the very success of the Americans, despite their heavy losses at the Marne, the praise they've received from the French, the fact that certainly the performance of the Americans here can be admired and praised. There's much to admire about it, given their inexperience. Does it feed into a certain amount of hubris from Pershing? And is it going to contribute to the difficulties the Americans are going to face through the autumn of 1918? I think that might be one for us to discuss next time, Dan.
Indeed. And much like the Doughboys in 1918, we too are going to go salient hopping, leaving the Marne salient, and our destination, of course, for next time out is going to be the Saint-Mihiel salient. So don't forget to tune in for that one. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
And I really enjoyed that one, and I'm enjoying the Americans. It's it's good fun.
It's good. I'm liking it too. All right, mate. I'll catch you a bit later on. Cheers, pal. Thanks. Bye.